Today's focus is the CMI5 overview and way ahead, featuring ADL Initiative CETA contractor Andy Johnson, the CMI5 working group leader Bill McDonald, and architect and principal engineer of the Catapult project Brian Miller. The collective expertise of this team spans over 50 years of distributed learning, implementing the AICC, SCORM, xAPI, and many other technical standards. Each speaker also has a unique perspective when it comes to conformance test suites and their importance. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Andy Johnson.
Hi, I'm Andy Johnson. I'm the ADL Initiative Specifications and Standards Manager. I'm really going to serve as kind of a go-between between the two main speakers. Bill McDonald will be first and Brian Miller will be second. Don't adjust your screens. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to let Bill take it over after a little bit. I just wanted to say a few things about the importance of CMI5 and in my role in government. I'm not a government person, but I've been a CETA contractor for the government for almost 20 years now. I've lived through the entire SCORM era of distributed learning, and I really do see that CMI5 is the DoD replacement for SCORM as we move forward into an era where we want to do things with xAPI and other types of tracking technology that goes beyond just education, but into actual learning performance, and to enable a lot of different things we research at the ADL Initiative, learner profiles and other types of advancements that we see as valuable for providing ROI for DoD in the long run. And CMI5 really bridges that gap from xAPI from SCORM to xAPI, and we see that as significant value added, and that's why you'll hear about the project afterward that ADL has invested in. I'd like to introduce Bill McDonald, though. He's been a longtime collaborator, friend of mine. He's really he was doing test suites before test suites were really a thing. Just hearing some of the history of how he worked with AICC to bring those standards, and a lot of that work really built the foundation for SCORM. So it's really awesome to be working with him and have him here to talk about the work that's been done with the CMI5 working group. So Bill, I think we're ready to kick it to you if you want to share your slides. Thank you.
Okay, what a great introduction. Well, let's get started. So this is going to be a conceptual overview of CMI5 for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and give you some of the key points as to why we're really excited about CMI5. Okay, so what is it? It's CMI5 is a profile. We're going to talk about what it is, the components, kind of the roles for using it in the CMI5 model, the kind of overview of the process of using it, talk about key CMI5 features, kind of what makes CMI5 different. And okay, let's get into it. What is it? Okay, it's an xAPI profile, and you know, if you're familiar with xAPI, you know that you need an extra set of rules if you want to use xAPI, because xAPI is very broad. We're very excited about CMI5 because it's not only a SCORM replacement, but it's also kind of a gateway to show other communities how to use xAPI. We see CMI5 kind of one person in our team describes it as the gateway drug. You know, once you implement it, you're probably going to want to do a lot more xAPI. CMI5 ensures plug and play interoperability. So it's not just an xAPI profile with verbs. It's also got launch mechanisms and a packaging specification. So it's got end-to-end interoperability. You'll be able to no custom engagements are going to be required to use CMI5. If both parties or both components are implementing it, they should work seamlessly. CMI5 is specifically designed for the LMS use case. xAPI can be used for many different things, but CMI5 is designed for the for the LMS use case. That being said, I think you're going to have a much more flexible LMS with CMI5. There's a lot more things that are possible. Okay, so let's do a little background. You know, Andy mentioned my long and storied history. CMI5 actually predates xAPI. So that might be confusing to some of you because it's an xAPI profile, but originally started off as an AICC project. And the idea was to find a replacement for SCORM and AICC specifications. And we decided we wanted to do a web service. And it was originally developed in SOAP. But when xAPI came along, we decided to reboot the project and build it on xAPI, which actually is kind of counterintuitive in that it's a lot harder to do than building something from the ground up. Crafting the CMI5 profile to work well with xAPI actually took us longer. You know, the AICC where this started dissolved in 2014, and the work, and I kind of came along with the work. We transferred it over to the ADL and continued on. Another thing about CMI5, you're probably kind of wondering what the 5 is for. It's not a version. CMI5 is just a name, but the versions of CMI5 are rock names. So we say the versions really rock. It's kind of a leftover from the AICC days of the CMI5 specification. The last major release was 4, and 5 was what this was, and it just became the name of the project. Long story short, it's just a name. The current version is called Quartz. So that's the particular rock name we picked for the first implementable version of CMI5. Okay, so, oops, sorry, wrong button. All right, so here's kind of an overview of the components. Okay, it should look familiar to you if you're, if you've used an LMS before. So one component is a course package, and in CMI5, a course package is similar to an analog in SCORM. There is an XML file, much simpler XML file, I must say, and that defines the course package. The course package can optionally be a zip file containing that XML file with all the media files, or it can just be the XML file by itself, pointing to the file locations. Obviously, an LMS is part of this model. The LMS, consumes the package, launches and tracks. And a part that might be new to some of you in this model is the learning record store. So the LMS needs to have a learning record store, obviously because of xAPI. And the LRS is considered part of the LMS in this case. We were conscious of the fact that LMSs would be getting a third-party LRS, so we tried to make our specification, work for that world. But the LMS would have to acquire or integrate with an LRS. So that's what handles the xAPI, tracking, data collection. And then we have an AU, and this is kind of AICC terminology, but an AU is an assignable unit. It's a launchable presentation. It's separately launchable by the LMS, and it retrieves and sends data to the LRS, and it's basically your learning content. So those are the components. Now let's go over the roles. There's basically 3 actors in this model. There's an author, an administrator, and a learner. So the learner is pretty obvious. That's the person taking the content. He logs in the LMS, launches the learning content, interacts with it. The author is the person who creates the course package. They might also create the content as well. That course package, gets provided by, the content provider author. Then the administrator takes that course package, imports it into the LMS, also assigns the learner to courses, and it's pretty much the same LMS model with very little variation. So that's the roles. Okay, now the process. So this is how it gets used. Author creates the assignable units, bundles them together in a course structure. Administrator imports the course structure. Administrator enrolls learner in the course. Learner initiates the AU, launches the AU, and this is, where things are a little bit different. There's a launch mechanism that's defined, and prior to the learner actually seeing the content, the LMS is going to send statements to the LRS indicating that the content was launched. It's also going to set some parameters and some state data that the AU can use. So the LMS is recording this data to the LMS, this launch data, prior to launching. Then the content actually gets launched. The content retrieves launch parameters from the LRS, retrieves previous state, if any, and then it will report data to the LRS when the learner has interacted with the content or completed the content. Okay, so here's some key features. This is kind of what makes CMI5 stand out from other profiles. It has a launch mechanism defined. This is really important. It's probably the key component to plug and play interoperability. The launch, there's also a fetch URL, and that's a parameter that's provided as part of the launch mechanism. The fetch URL is for getting the authorization token for the content to be able to be authorized to access the LRS. CMI5 has session management, so we define a context, a session ID to put all the statements kind of in one folder or one container, so to speak, for each session, so that you can easily report on it. CMI5 is also extensible. We don't say that to use our profile you have to use specific verbs. We have a set of verbs that have a specific purpose, but you can write any other statements you want with any of the verbs you want, as long as you adhere to some of our session management rules. So let's dive in a little bit to each one of these features. So this is what the launch URL looks like. There's a URL to the content, and there's a query string, and a query string contains the parameters. So if you're familiar with HTTP and URLs, this might make sense. If not, it's gobbledygook, but basically this is the web link that launches the content. So the query string parameters are as follows. There's the location of the LRS, the LRS endpoint, how the content is going to reach out to the LRS. There's an identifier for the learner. There's an activity ID which identifies the content. There's registration, and the fetch URL, which I mentioned earlier, which it needs to connect. So here's an example of what all that looks like. Oops, sorry, a lot of stuff, but very important for making the content work. So here's the fetch URL. The AU must get its authorization token from the fetch URL. This is something that the LMS generates. The fetch URL may only be called once, so this is kind of a security mechanism of sorts. So if it fails, you'll have to relaunch your content. For session management, our definition of a session is time to launch till termination. All the statements made within a session must have a CMI5 session ID and CMI5 context. The LMS manages the session creation. So the LMS creates the session ID. Now the CMI5 has rules for specific statements to be sent to the LRS. Now it's also extensible. So since even though we have specified types of statements for specific purposes, you can send additional custom statements. So you can send, like I said before, any statements you want. We call these CMI5 allowed statements. They must contain the same CMI5 identification, and they must contain the same context. But you can record whatever you want within those parameters. So you're not limited to the CMI5 set of verbs. So I like to call this CMI5 is a floor rather than a ceiling. So it establishes a baseline. You can make any other statements you want. So there's really, because of you have the power of xAPI and you have this interoperability. So you can do quite a bit in terms of data collection, and it'll all get recorded. And you know, you're not limited by CMI5. CMI5 actually enhances your ability to deliver the content and to get data collection. So you can stick with the minimum CMI5 verbs, or you can, you know, go crazy and record all kinds of data. But it will still be within that session envelope, and it will be easily reportable. Now, I kind of went through this fast, so we have time for questions, but everything I just described is at our project site. These slides are based on presentations on our project site. So I encourage you to go there. We also have our weekly meeting information there. Be happy to have any of you come and ask questions about what we're doing with CMI5. We have lots of interesting discussions, and that's it. So, Andy.
Yep, great. Thanks, Bill. I think we're going to throw a little bit. I know I talked about doing all the questions at the end, but there's a couple that have come through that I want people to roll into the second half of this having the answers to. So a couple acronyms that you might be familiar with, might not. I know we didn't really get into it too much, but the LRS, if you've been watching the chat, is a learning record store. And that's basically the receiver end of xAPI data. xAPI is meant to be a web service, and there's both the sending and receiving of data. And an LRS is basically dumb LRS storage that allows both storage and retrieval of xAPI data. So to kind of put that with another question that came in where somebody said, I don't think an LMS automatically has an LRS. That's exactly true. The LRS is a web service that would have to be essentially part of the LMS suite of services. Really, we look at an LMS as a suite of web services. This would be another capability that it would have to contain to function with CMI5. Another one that somebody made a great observation of is the AU, or assignable unit. They called it akin to a SCO. That is exactly true in SCORM. A SCO/AU is the same thing. If you look at actually a very early version of SCORM, they even called them AUs before they called them SCOs. So I would consider it and any of my colleagues can chime in on this too, probably the smallest launchable resource you would want to have that doesn't in any way constrain you technologically speaking, but from a design perspective, thinking of it as, you know, as the smallest unit you would want to have somebody tag with metadata and launch. So Bill, to kind of a little bit more of an open-ended question that came over too that I'd like to see if you don't mind answering is, can you describe and I'm going to paraphrase this because it was a series of questions. Can you describe the roles of the AICC standards and xAPI standards in CMI5?
Well, going back, as Andy said, we have a long history with this. AICC predates SCORM by several years, and we actually developed an interoperability spec using text files, which I later worked on a web standard for, which is the AICC you know now, and then later SCORM came from that data model. The CMI5 project started because the AICC and SCORM specifications drifted, and we had lots of discussions with the ADL about how to put Humpty Dumpty back together. And then it went on for so long that we decided, let's just replace it with a web service. And that's when we started working on the original CMI5, which was SOAP based. xAPI was being developed almost at the same time, and then a lot of people on the team kept saying, well, why don't you guys use this? So we did. We switched. We decided we don't want to create another diversion of standards. We want to try to keep everything, you know, unified. So we continued. We basically rewrote CMI5. Started in 2012, adopting xAPI. xAPI meant all of the original goals of the CMI5 project for being able to record whatever you want, being a web service, and being extensible. So it was a perfect fit. And the AICC, had full intentions of finishing it off, but our AICC's membership was declining, and we didn't have enough resources to keep it going. So we transferred it over to the ADL, and we've finished the job.
All right, great. Thanks, Bill. So a couple other questions that have come over. One, do we need to send statements directly from the LMS or from other source, such as an Alexa device? And the answer to that is that xAPI, as long as you have basically have HTTP access, you can send statements. I've seen people use wearables. It works with Internet of Things devices. So if it can be sent that way with xAPI, it can also be sent that way with CMI5. Another question that came over, kind of go hand in hand, so I'll answer both of those as well, unless, again, my colleagues want to chime in. One, do LMSs have support for CMI5 today? Is a specific player required? And which authoring tools currently published to CMI5? I would recommend for all those questions that you go to the CMI5 project page, as well as the ADL website, because both of those are somewhat tracked. ADL tracks xAPI adoption, and the CMI5 working group tracks, to some extent, any sort of self-reported CMI5 adoption. If you are a product or service or LMS that supports CMI5, please let our group know, and we will make sure that you make that list. And that list will be something I'll put in the chat in just a little bit, as soon as I introduce our next speaker. So I think for now, just to make sure Brian has enough time, and I think I nipped every question I saw in the chat, or at least paraphrased it. If not, feel free to ask it again. Want to kick it over to Brian Miller, but basically Brian's going to get into the other side of this coin, and it's something that I've grown to see is both specs and standards manager and somebody who's answered probably 10,000 help desk tickets on SCORM in my career, is that the balance of creating tools and examples is so beneficial to any sort of spec and standards adoption. I think that's one of the reasons that SCORM did have so much success, is that there was a great deal of support in terms of those content examples and test suites and even certification programs. I think all those go hand in hand. So with that in mind, ADL wanted to make sure that CMI5 had a similar method for a path for success. So that's where we essentially contracted with Rustici Software to bring that in. Brian Miller has been on the CMI5 working group for some time, and as many of his colleagues have as well. They've been involved with SCORM and xAPI since basically the beginning of each. So they have a strong history and experience with both of those standards. So they really know where we're coming from in this. And Brian Miller has been one of the key developers in most of their xAPI and CMI5 technology. So with that, I'd like to introduce Brian Miller. So Brian, if you can take it away, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. So as Andy said, ADL contracted with Rustici Software to build essentially a set of tools to increase adoption, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. So what is Catapult? And our expected outcomes from this project. I'll take a review of the prototype. I've already seen there were some questions in the chat. Hopefully I can cover those things. Anything that I don't cover, please feel free to ask at the end. We'll look at the schedule and kind of what our next steps are. So what is Catapult? Catapult, we loosely put together an acronym here, CMI5 Advanced Testing Application and Player Underpinning Learning Technologies. So what is that? Well, it's a year-long project to essentially fix what we had seen as a chicken and egg problem. Again, some of you alluded to that in the chat window. One of Bill's slides showed that we really considered CMI5 implementable in 2016. That is essentially the release date of when the specification was considered good enough. At that point, I had implemented CMI5 itself on the LMS side and on the content side. So we kind of verified that, yes, you can go out there and actually implement the specification. Since that time, the last 5 years, we've seen relatively slow adoption. And some of that is because we would talk to customers and customers saying, well, I want, some CMI5 content. I want to be able to do advanced things with xAPI, but I have nowhere to play it. None of the LMSs support it. On the flip side, we would talk to our LMS vendors and they would just frankly say, well, we haven't seen any requests for this. So if there's no content out there, there's no authoring tools that provide it, then we're not going to add it to our software. And so that was really one of the biggest problems with CMI5 over the last few years. Even though the working group has been doing a good job and working hard to make sure it was finalized and create resources around it, such as the slideshow Bill showed, we just really haven't been able to see the adoption. But that's really where the ADL and DoD come in. So for the DoD to have procurement resources and to actually want to purchase software that it leverages CMI5, they need to be able to guarantee interoperability. They need to be able to guarantee that it's valid long term. So what we did was we set out a 12-month project to essentially develop tools, create test suites, provide additional documentation, best practices for those tools, to really increase the ability for the DoD to go out and procure software and technology and content that is guaranteed to work, that is guaranteed to be interoperable. So we, started out the project by talking to our stakeholders, which represent a pretty good slice, I think, of the DoD. A number of them have already had CMI5 experience. Some of them have worked with it in the past. Some of them have a tremendous amount of experience in, what that word interoperability means within the DoD. So we learned a lot in talking to them about what would be required for them to be able to feel confident in being able to select a product or to create a system that leverages the CMI5 specification. So our expected outcomes, again, we want to support the adoption of CMI5 and tangentially xAPI across the DoD, from development to procurement. Those are big things. Rusty Software was involved in the most recent DoD that included CMI5 as a tangible reference, but it really needs to become a thing that can be adopted easily and quickly without a tremendous amount of expertise on the actual interoperability, the specification itself. So that's where the procurement part comes in. We want to be able to offer, course creators the ability to migrate their legacy content. Obviously, there's a lot of content out there, content that's been developed for 20 plus years. It's not going to be trivial to move that forward, but if we can provide resources, provide documentation about how to move from a SCORM model, how to move from an AICC model, then that should increase the adoption. And additionally, that'll make it more seamless when you're talking about a piece of content that's been transitioned from a legacy standard to something, a piece of content that's being created now from scratch on the latest products. And we need to provide not only to the DoD, we need to provide the ability to vendors and industry members to incorporate CMI5 so that they can make their products available when the DoD comes calling. So what did we end up with? On the actual software side, what we ended up with was 3 pieces that were really missing in this procurement sphere. And the first is a prototype player, something that can be looked at as an example of how to implement CMI5 for the LMS side, a content testing application. So if I go out and I'm creating an authoring tool, or I've purchased an authoring tool or using an authoring tool to develop the content, I need a place to be able to play that content and be guaranteed that, yes, it is going to meet the CMI5 specification rules. And then thirdly, the LMS testing side. So for the LMS vendors or people procuring an LMS, they need to be able to test that LMS to say, yes, I know that if I go and use an authoring tool, buy some off-the-shelf content, develop it myself, that content is going to be able to play in an LMS test or in an LMS and follow the rules. So our player prototype, essentially, this is a web service API. We talked a little bit about the LRS and then the LMS side. So what we envision here is a player web service API that sits in between the LMS and the LRS. That player web service will do things such as manage the session state. It will do validation that the xAPI statements being sent have all of the proper CMI5 parts to them. So for those of you that are familiar, there's a context template, the actor has to match, the registration has to match, all of those elements that came across in the query string need to be validated by the player, and anything that's not, to the specification rules will have to be rejected at that point. So again, it's a player web service API. It sits in between the LMS and the LRS. It provides the ability to launch or get a launch link. So a link to an assignable unit. When that assignable unit uses that link or plays that link, then it can hit the fetch URL, which will be provided by this player web service API. And then it will essentially act as a pass-through for any LRS that already exists. So there are a number of LRSs already on the market. The player web service API is being developed in such a way that you can leverage any one of those. So then the next piece was the content testing component. This is a little bit more complicated setup. So this is a browser-based user interface that will have authentication, authorization, those types of things built in. And it will essentially talk to a web service API that is acting very much like an LMS would. But instead of being an LMS, what its job primarily is to manage tests. And so the tests themselves will be initiated through the UI. It will connect to the web service API that will create the test. And then that test will associate all of the data that it sees being passed through its own service to the player prototype. So it's acting a bit like a proxy. So when a test is initiated, then you would get a display of your course structure. You'll be able to import your course structure files or your course packages. You'll see a log on what parts of those course structure were invalid if they're not correct, or maybe best practices will be shown if certain best practices aren't being met. Essentially, you'll have a log of the import of that package or course structure. From there, the course structure itself is viewable in the UI, and each piece of that course structure can then be launched. So each of the assignable units. All of those assignable units have various preferences or configurations that can be determined at launch time, and those will be set through that UI. And then essentially the AU will be playing inside of this content testing application. And what we've done is we've set it up so that all the requests that normally would go directly to the LRS are going through the content testing platform. And so it can also provide additional validation. We can check to make sure that statements meet the requirements. We can again log whether or not statements are being issued in best practices. We can make sure that the fetch URL is only accessed a single time, all of those types of things through this web service API. And then for providing the actual player functionality, it will leverage the player prototype that I described on the first screen. So again, this web service API will sit in between the browser UI and that player prototype. So in a sense, we are doing somewhat of our own validation of that player prototype simply by using it to support the content testing application. And then finally, the LMS test piece. So in this case, we're really targeting vendors of LMSs or people that would be procuring an LMS. And so it's a little bit more complicated. It's a command line interface. It doesn't really have a graphical user interface. And essentially what we are developing is a command line interface that will talk to what we're referring to as an LMS integration interface. So there are certain calls that are outside of the scope of the CMI5 specification that have to be supported. So for instance, getting registration details or getting the session details. Those are parts that have to be implemented by an LMS when implementing CMI5. And so this command line interface will access that LMS through that interface. So an LMS vendor would have to go out and actually do some coding. They will have to actually implement this interface that provides back session details, registration details, launch AU links, etc. And then along with this command line interface, we have a test package library. And this is essentially a set of CMI5 packages that, when loaded into the LMS and played through completion, test in the individual requirements of the specification. So for instance, if we need a package that hits the fetch URL twice in a row, that might be one test package. So when you imported that into an LMS and you access the assignable units launch link, then that assignable unit would automatically hit the fetch URL twice, and we expect the LMS to throw an error on the second access of that fetch URL. And so that's the type of thing that this LMS test suite will be doing. Along with that, we expect to run very similar to the way the old SCORM testing worked, which is a set of instructions that essentially allow you to do all of those steps manually if you so desired, or if you did not want to implement the command line interface. So again, essentially this would be load up test package 1 in your LMS, launch assignable unit 1, and verify that assignable unit had an error on accessing the fetch URL the second time, and then go to test package 2, test package 3, etc., which tends to be a long, arduous process, which is why we have the command line interface, but it will be an option for someone that doesn't want to implement that interface. So just going to go through a real brief look at our UI UX design. So this is essentially the homepage for the Catapult content testing suite. You can see that there's a list of courses here. The title's there on the left. We can see the last test result and when it was last tested. And then we have buttons for adding, a new course, creating a new test, deleting courses, etc. And then this is a quick look at the actual test page. So we can see over there on the right that the conformance status for this particular course right now, one of the AUs is being seen as spec conformant, and the other AUs haven't been accessed yet. On the left side, we can see the registration, which is simply matches directly to a test instance. We can see the configuration for that test instance. We can see the actor there that's being used. And then the list of assignable units below, where we can do things such as launch the assignable unit, or we can waive an assignable unit, all of the different things that are required by the specification that we need to be able to execute through this UI. So our schedule, I know there were a couple of questions in the chat window about this already. When will it be available? So we've gone through essentially, or we'll be going through 3 phases: the design, the requirements, creating the user experience. All of that is essentially complete, or at least complete enough for us to have started development. So we have a system architecture document that's available. We have a set of design requirements. Obviously, I've shown a few screen captures of what we consider to be the UI UX for the content testing suite, etc. And then, so right now we're kind of, I would say, in the first third of the development phase. So right now we have a CMI5 player prototype that is, it is getting close to being able to do all of the things that it needs to do. We have a conformance test suite with the UI where you have the ability to import a course. You have the ability to see the course structure. You have the ability to launch AUs. And that's essentially where we are right now. There's still a fair amount to do around actual specification requirements and making sure that those are being met. There's a great document that the working group put together quite a while ago, actually, that has all of those test requirements, or all of the spec requirements in a test list. And so we'll be leveraging that. And then we have access to some courses that have been provided by the various DoD stakeholders, and we're going to be looking at how we can transition those courses from their existing learning specifications to CMI5. And then the last phase, when hopefully all of this development is much further along, is creation of a best practices guide, creation of user documentation. We'll have the exemplar courses that will have been built by the course templates. And then there are a series of webinars that are planned for kind of the end of this project. So hopefully we can show off exactly what we've built and make sure that everyone has a good feel for how this can be used to increase CMI5 adoption. And that's really all we have on on our slide deck here. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, we certainly have our share of questions. I think we can easily take this. We don't have to worry about being too short on content. So I think this is a question for either Bill or Brian. Why in CMI5 does the packaging manifest use XML instead of JSON or something a bit more modern?
It's what we started with, we just didn't bother to update. There was some discussion, but by the time we talked about using JSON, we've gone down the road pretty far. So I don't really have a good answer for that. But a lot of the initial work was done with XML, and I think we just kept it.
Well, I'll add, I think there's some interesting technical reasons to stick with XML for quote unquote manifest or structure type files. The ability to do commenting is kind of a big one for me. JSON lacks that ability unless you're working with, a particular implementation of JSON. Some of the handling around CData file or fields, UTF-8 character strings, all of that. XML is just really well designed from that standpoint. And since it's a relatively low frequency, use case of importing a course structure, of importing a course package, the benefits from reduced size and those types of things aren't as much of a big deal as they are with, for instance, an xAPI statement, where just the size of XML with a statement would get unwieldy, even for statements that are already sometimes unwieldy.
I'm glad we made the right call.
Yeah. So there's a couple questions that revolve around specific products, and I don't think we're going to get into those types of questions. I'd say that if anybody does have specific product knowledge, they're free to share that in the chat, but otherwise we'll be a little bit more vendor neutral here in terms of addressing those. We did have a question that kind of I'm going to give a general answer to, is that how many LMS platforms are using CMI5 today, and what are the limitations? There's also a question that talked about SCORM LMSs still being needed. And I'll just say that in terms of what an LMS can provide, you can support multiple standards. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. This is just an avenue to use something that's going to solve some of the problems that Bill talked about, that's going to enable xAPI usage. There's nothing, if you still have a SCORM course, there's nothing to stop an LMS from still using that and storing it differently. You need to have an LRS capability for CMI5, but it's not really this complex thing that's going to be overly difficult to implement. It's simply another web service.
Andy, there was a question in there about what. Please share something that you can't do in SCORM that you can do with xAPI. This may seem unusual, but if xAPI allows you to record a lot more than SCORM. It allows you to record stuff that's not defined. It also allows you to have attachments. So you could attach digital data to a statement if your LRS supports it. That's something you can't do with SCORM.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that even like Art Workington's a member of our working group, and he's even developed apps that essentially are he's done micro learning with texts, with SMS technology. So not being tied to that browser is a big one. So there's certainly a lot of things that you can do outside of it. We did have one there's one question that was asked that I really want to make sure we answer. It's that I think the issue of understanding what CMI5 provides. Most folks are looking at basic things such as pass, fail, complete, incomplete. And that's the exact reason why we started with CMI5, is because those are the CMI5 specification contains only 9 verbs. And those verbs get at those very specific LMS events of launching content, passing it, failing it, and in satisfying the AU that you're in, and marking completions. That is the basic use case we sought to provide a baseline to, and then anything else is allowed with CMI5 allowed statements within CMI5.
Yeah, can I interject there, Andy? The one thing with CMI5 and the xAPI is that CMI5 is really providing session management. So over the last, however many years, 8 years, the thing that always seemed to come up with xAPI was, well, the very first thing you have to do is decide, okay, when did someone start their experience and when did they end it? And that's what CMI5 does. CMI5 says, we know exactly when your session started, because and it's a parity thing. So the LMS has to send a statement to indicate that it was launching. The AU has to send a statement that it was initialized. And so we know with those two statements that the two systems were talking correctly, and that we know that that's when the learner, when the actor started their experience. And then the session itself has to have an end. And we see the terminated statement from the assignable unit, or the LMS can mark a session as abandoned, and it won't accept any more data outside of that session once it's been abandoned. So we know now exactly when the experience started, exactly when the experience ended. And that's a big thing for literally every xAPI experience. Probably needs to start with those questions. So CMI5 automatically adds that in.
Right.
And then beyond that, we have 3 implementations of CMI5 in our product right now. We have the video profile. Probably one of the most common experiences these days is watching a video. So we can wrap watching the video itself in a CMI5 session, and then we're capturing the xAPI statements for the video profile within that session. And it works really well together. The same thing for PDFs. So if you launch a PDF, then we know your experience for that PDF has started, and then we can see that when you change a page, well, we get an xAPI statement for that, and it's using a PDF viewing profile that's very simple. So again, it's the combination of putting multiple profiles together that really allow us to leverage CMI5 session management without having to do that in every other profile. And it's just providing some markers. So now the LMS reporting tools, if they want to show which parts of the video were watched by a particular actor, that's pretty easy to do with the video profile. And it can start out with just saying, we know when the session started, we know when the session ended, and we know whether it was completed or passed.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to ask a quick acquisition. There's a quick acquisition comment. It says we have an LMS but don't have an LRS contract. Do we need an LRS to use CMI5 to implement xAPI content? Again, I think of these more as web services. If you have an LMS, I think getting LRS capability is more of the key than getting another software product or contract. Or maybe you can get a cheaper contract to do that. You don't need CMI5 to implement xAPI, but I would caution, if you are looking at an authoring tool, the authoring tool's variance in what output you're going to get for xAPI is going to be so drastic that it's going to be very difficult to use. You're really going to want to have that grounded in CMI5. I think for systems, a basic LRS is all you're going to need. There might be some value in an LRS having some sort of CMI5 reporting support, but it's not as critical. The LRS-based capability should be enough. Next question I have is there a necessity to assure security for LRSs, and would this impact interoperability of xAPI? So, I mean, the xAPI spec intentionally kind of punts on security. Obviously, it's important to follow current security best practices, but it's very hard to ground those in a standard because standards move slower than security does. So we've intentionally kind of punted on that issue. It would make it as interoperable as anything. REST doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and that's what xAPI is founded on. So I wouldn't think that there's going to be any security wrinkle that breaks xAPI. Brian, do you have any comments on that?
No, just my standard spiel about that word security is a very big, broad-based topic. So there are some things in CMI5 that are intended to improve the launch experience. For instance, the fetch URL, again, only being accessible once. It would really be up to the LMS/LRS to implement the authorization to the LRS in such a way that it's really limited to allowing what can occur within a CMI5 session. It should only, be leverageable for a single session, like those types of things, which are really they're best practices for an implementation. It is a thing that we would expect to see in our document coming out of Project Catapult, but as Andy said, it's not really easily addressable via the specification, kind of beyond what we've said, where you can only access the fetch URL once, you can only get the token once, and then it's really up to the implementers.
Great. And just a couple clarifications on questions we've had. All of this, Brian's project will be wrapped up by September of this year and will be made available immediately afterwards. It will support offline use cases. You can download and use it. I'm assuming the offline case was not necessarily talked about for LRSs, but xAPI does also support offline use, provided you can link that back up. Brian, actually, Bill, I'll give you one. Bill, can you talk to how CMI5 supports content and learning outside the traditional LMS and whether it can track videos, PDFs, et cetera?
Outside the traditional LMS. I guess you can track a lot more stuff than you can normally. And you, as mentioned earlier, you're not tied to a browser because it is a web service. So the way that the ways that that are available to you to implement it are broader. It's going to have to be launched by something, and that something has got to create the launch mechanism. Your LMS does not have to look like a regular LMS to do that. You can create deep links basically to launch content, and different systems can be developed to broker that. Almost all the people who are developing content for xAPI right now have to have content that is launched and has to have that information passed to it on how to locate the LRS and record data. So unless your content magically knows where the LRS is, or it's got it hard-coded inside of it somehow, you have to have that launch mechanism. So with the launch mechanism, you can pretty much create all kinds of different learning experiences that aren't really like the traditional LMS if you want.
Right. In the course structure format of CMI5 allows you to simply link content rather than requiring that you have it in a certain package. So that enables all kinds of,
right.
If it has a URL, you can launch it.
Right. You don't have to store it on the LMS. Now there's still cross-domain rules still apply, but one of the reasons why we went down the CMI5 road back in the AICC days was we wanted to be able to promote third-party content hosting outside of the LMS host.
Yep. Brian, can you talk about how CMI5 compares with SCORM and Tin Can? Kind of clear some of that up.
Boy. Well, obviously, SCORM itself doesn't use xAPI, so that's one of the big things. With Tin Can, the Tin Can launch specification was something developed with a very early version of the xAPI specification. Before it was xAPI, it was Tin Can, the 0.9 version. It never really went through peer review. It was a set of launch guidelines. It was a set of guidelines of how you might use this new thing, Tin Can, now xAPI, from an LMS. The security things that are in there around the authentication to the LRS, similar to the way CMI5 does it, but they're not as secure. There's no such concept as a fetch URL. You just have the token itself in the launch string, which is problematic for any number of reasons, such as server log files, easily reproducing the launch link and giving it to someone else, any number of those types of things. There's essentially no what I would refer to as information model with the Tin Can launch guidelines. In other words, frankly, you don't even have to use xAPI. You don't have to use the endpoint. You don't have to use the credential. There's nothing as far as session management or completed statements, past statements, those types of information model data items just don't exist there. So it's real limited on the interoperability side. It's limited to say, here I have this Tin Can package, or I have multiple Tin Can packages, and I know they're going to behave in a similar way. They really don't have to at all. SCORM is SCORM is so different. You know, there's the JavaScript API with the runtime. As Bill said, there's a very limited information model, or at least very static information model. You get what you get, and that's pretty much it. So those are probably the big differences. You know, as Andy said before, you know, there's no reason why you have to run out. You know, there's no one saying, oh, well, SCORM is not going to work in 2022, right? It's just with the capabilities of xAPI, with the ability to have the session management from CMI5, and the ability to launch all the different ways that Bill just described, I think that's the benefit over those other two things. Personally, I love for the tin can launch guidelines to just go away. In favor of CMI5. That hasn't happened as aggressively as I would like, but it, you know, hopefully with Project Catapult, with getting these ability to increase adoption, that we'll see that happening.
Cool, thank you, Brian. Another question, does CMI5 have any advantages in restoring state in the content? And to me, this is one of the biggies for xAPI, is that if there was some sort of malicious intent or accidents that are happening, or even cheating, SCORM is a state-based model, and once that state's overwritten, you have no record of why it is. If somebody marked all their scores to 100, then you would have no idea that they used to be something else. With xAPI, every record is timestamped, so you would have that kind of audit trail. So in a blockchain ledger-based world where we want things to have evidence, xAPI and therefore CMI5 have great value in that regard. All right, so I would just say one I have is any samples of data that is captured in CMI5, statements, verbs, score, etc. Again, I would refer to the resource that's been kind of linked many times in the chat, which is the CMI5 working group site. This working group has done a phenomenal job of keeping up content examples, statement examples, use cases, commonly asked questions, even highlighting dumb things that people have done. Like it's a great resource. It has all the meeting minutes. Again, use that site. Join us on Friday calls. We'd love to hear from you. So yeah, use that as a resource, and please join us.
Okay, all right. Well, we're almost at about time, so I would like to thank everybody for joining today and thank the speakers. Would any of the speakers have any final words to share with us before we leave?
I would have one. The only thing I could say is I would encourage everyone who's asking questions, you know, such as my LMS doesn't have an LRS, push on your vendors, whether that's on the authoring tool side or the LMS side. Push on them. Say, I want CMI5. You know, I'm excited for the capability here. There's something that I want to do with it. Really push on the vendors, because that's, like I said, the chicken and egg that we've seen for the last few years. The best way to do that is for people to feel the pressure to implement it.
I'd like to say that I've worked on pretty much all of the major learning standards for LMSs, and this is the one I'm the most excited about. I'm really, it's taking all my energy just to curb my enthusiasm right now, let me tell you. It's awesome, and we highly encourage you to come to the meetings, ask your questions. It's a participative environment. We like to hear your feedback and ask questions and see how the sausage is made.
All right, thank you. So thank you to the speakers. Thanks to everybody who came in and asked so many great questions. There are some links in the chat that you will have access to even if you log out. So here's another one in case you need it. The CMI5 page on adlnet.gov. And we'd like to invite you to attend our next webinar that is happening on April 21st, and it's virtual reality and training, which you can find at this link in the chat. It's adlnet.gov/webinars. And with that, I think we will say goodbye, and hopefully everybody has a great day.